Welcome back to another pen talk. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for following me on my pen journey. We're going to go on a different road in this video. A few viewers have asked about vintage, and I mentioned that I have a few. I've been collecting for a while. And this is a pen from my early days of collecting, when I used to just go to flea markets and antique shops, and this was before anybody felt there was any value in fountain pens, so you're able to find some interesting pens at reasonably priced, $1 or $2. And this was one of them. I've had this in my collection for probably over 40 years. And if we look at it, we'll notice a very distinctive clip. My lighting guy's just not following through like they should. So you can see it's an ideal clip. And it's an old one. Interesting, that little breather hole there at the top, usually there in the sides. As we come down, we're going to notice the other thing that you do when you have a Waterman pen, especially a vintage pen. There's an identification at the bottom of the barrel. So this is a 12 SF, and we'll explore that a little bit more detail later on. And then also there's usually some markings on the barrel, and we find the traditional markings. And the latest patent date is 1903. So I think this pen was made around 1910. As we turn it around, we'll see it does have a flaw. The cap is cracked, and I think somebody tried to put some glue on it, but that's not something I would do. It's a pull-off cap, and we see the standard number 2 nib, and we know it's a number 2 nib because of the second digit on the end of the barrel, which was a 2. Your classic spoon feed, and no, I'm going to knock this all apart, so I'm not worried about nib and feed positioning. But what makes this pen unique is the filling system. It's a push lever, not a box lever, which Waterman used later on. And the sack is obviously missing. And what's also obvious once you take the cap off is the amount of oxidation that this hard rubber pen has had. So I'm going to go through a little bit of cleanup work. We'll unscrew this end piece. And there's another hole at the top there, so that's interesting. Somebody also polished, I think that's polish left there around there. So we're going to clean this thing up, get it working, and see how that nib's going to write. As expected, it's a pretty soft nib. So the journey continues. I'll need a few hours working on this before it's ready again to be seen in the video. A few hours later, I've cleaned up the cap to the best of my ability and what I think I'm comfortable with. Yes, it's not pitch black, and some people use shoe polish, some people use some chemicals. I polish it with this. So a lot of the discoloration is oxidation of the hard rubber. So you clean that off, and then I do my final thing with this. There's a whole bunch of discussions on waxing versus not waxing. I mean, Canuba wax is great because it really bonds with the hard rubber, and this has protecting polymers in it that'll help minimize further damage from UV and the sun. And the other thing that's nice is the imprint on that cap is very clear now as we get the camera to focus. And it says clip cap. It took some effort to pull out the section. I was concerned it could have been a screw fit, but You know, you always unscrew first, and then if it starts moving and you feel it's going to be a pressure fit, then a little pulling could help out. And that pressure bar in there is connected to the back of the cap here with a rod, so it moves up and down like this, not like that, like a lot of other levers would do. So I'm just going to clean this up as much as I can. I'm going to do my same type of thing with semi-chrome and then wax on it. And finally, with both of these, I'll do a thorough cleaning of the inside with water and maybe a mild soap. And it's one reason why I want to wax and clean everything on the outside of the pen to minimize any damage from the water. You may ask, what's the best method to knock out the nib and feed out of these vintage pens? Well, you get a knockout block. Almost all the pen restorers online have versions of these. You get the biggest rod you can get. You stick it in there. You tap a little bit. Sometimes I use a hammer, but you pop out the nib and feed, of course, as they roll away. And now you're ready to clean them up and reassemble them and make certain the nib and feed are properly set and oriented. Well, I've cleaned up everything as well as I can. And here's that rag that I used with semi-chrome, and it takes off kind of like that yellow oxidation that's on the outside of the black rubber. It's not perfect, but like I said, it's an old pen. I cleaned up the pressure bar in there as well as I could. I just put some of that semi-chrome on here, rubbed it around. I also used these polishing pads. So at the end of the day, I'm quite happy. I'm now going to reassemble it, see a sack that'll fit, put it together, and see if my effort was worth by rewarding me with a great writing experience. Well, the nib has been cleaned up, and it is clearly a number 2. And what I find interesting is the way that they've ground that end. Hopefully the light's picking it up. And I'd say that's definitely a medium type nib, which is kind of rare for these. They're generally fine to extra fine. So I'm excited to put nib to paper and see if this performs well. That slit's open pretty good, but it does touch here at the end, which is what you want. So that's not something that I'm going to be able to adjust. I'm certain some of the more experienced nib people could offer me some suggestions or offer to maybe change the nib a little bit, but I'm going to see how it writes first before I consider anything needs to be done to it. So this is the glue I use to glue the sack to the section. I use it because it doesn't impact either the latex sack or the hard rubber section. And if you need to remove the bladder, it can be done relatively easily, but it provides a waterproof, watertight seal. And then where the sack joins the section, I use this pen sack cement, which some people use this between the sack and the section, but I don't, because this is more of a permanent type of solution. And I've had some major issues trying to get sacks off that I think were cemented on with this type of cement. I had to sand the section a little bit because the section was a very tight fit into the barrel, and just that little bit of shellac I put on made it a tight fit. So I sanded it a little bit, put a little bit of silicone grease in, and it slid right in, and it will be there until I want to remove it. We're ready for final assembly. You know, with my restoration intention, I think this came out well. So I put a little bit of wood glue underneath of that sack when I slipped it over the section. I let it dry for almost 24 hours, and then I did a shellac seal at the end. That'll make certain there's no airflow between the sack and the section, and also provide some stability to that sack at the end of the section. Yeah, like I say, I'm happy with how it cleaned up. It's not perfect, but as I mentioned, it's over 100-year-old pen, so therefore perfect is not the intention, but it's certainly functional, usable. So we're going to talc up the sack, insert it into the barrel. I chose a number 17 sack, and I choose sacks based on how they fit inside the barrel. And this one is a little snug, but it'll work fine once I put some talc on that sack. It'll slide in very easily. And also I measured the length, and it looks like it'll do fine. So I'm anxious to put some ink in here and see how that nib works. So what ink to put into this vintage pen? I chose this one for a couple of reasons. Number one, with that ITF, with that solution, this is a very wetting ink, a good flowing ink, and I think it's important with the way that nib is made up in that pen. Here's the color card. It's on the light side, but I expect that nib to be fairly wet, so I'm not concerned about an ink like this not working well. And we'll take a quick look at the chromatography. Nothing special, basically a blue ink, no water resistance, but I think it might work fine. Now that we've gone through the restoration, I think we need a little bit of history. So why did Waterman come out with this pen? I think this is the first self-filling pen that they've had, and I could be mistaken, but I'm pretty certain. This predates the lever fill, the box lever that Waterman used later on, probably at 1914 or 15. And around this time, Schaefer patented their lever filler. And I think a lot of pen manufacturers were concerned about violating that patent, so therefore they had to come up with something different. Parker came up with their button filler, so that's how they got around that. And the other thing to keep in mind is we should look at these patent dates here, because that's where I think it really is able to put the pen into a certain category. So the top there is the 1910, and then below it is the 1905, and then on the barrel we have the 1899, and again there's a 1903, and underneath of the feed there also is those same patent dates that are on the barrel. So that's where I take this pen between 1910 and 1915. I put it more towards the early 1910 based on the condition and, you know, just my gut feel. Here's a page in the Waterman catalog that I use, and Troy also uses that similar book. So this is a little bit of history, a little bit of nostalgia. And now we're going to see how that Monteverde ink works in this pen. So now comes the real test. How does it write? So the pen is fairly light. We'll give you those weights. And it does post fine. I don't think the cap is going to be any more spread out by the posting, and it really does work with the design with this sleeve here, but it makes for a very long pen. So I will prefer to write with it unposted, and it also won't hit the tripod. I had the microphone next to the paper so you could hear the nib. So the nib just writes smooth. And it is a little bit sensitive. I should have cleaned out that feed. I did soak it. I did, use a paper towel to go through that groove, but I should have went through the groove with a sharp instrument and cleaned out any stuff that was in there, because the feed is just a little bit wonky. I mean, sometimes it does really well, and then other times it seems to be a little bit starved, but this is still a phenomenal nib. I mean, that's an unbelievable variation between those horizontal and vertical strokes. Then we need to spell my favorite word. And this does flex. I'd say it takes a medium amount of pressure. So that takes it out of the wet noodle category. Even though the variation is certainly close to being a wet noodle from that viewpoint, but to me the wet noodle requires less pressure to get it to spread. So I don't rank vintage pens, and if I was to start, I'd rate this at a 9.6. And like I said, I'm not too worried about that nib. Sometimes it'll write a good half a page without any issues. And like I said, I'm going to, when I'm done with this fill, I'm going to pop it open again and clean it out more, because this ink was a little bit darker in the beginning because there was still something left in the feed. So I hope you've enjoyed this view at a vintage pen. So we're going to say thank you for watching. This rewards a nice, consistent, gentle hand, which unfortunately I do not have. So we've reached the end of this video. May you have many great, phenomenal writing experiences. Hopefully, if a vintage pen is something that appeals to you, hopefully you get a chance to at least write with one. If not, maybe potentially own one. We're going to say bye for now. Yep, we do occasionally get that. The ink just doesn't flow as well as I expected it to. A lot of it may have to do with that distance between the feed and the nib, or I may have to just get used to this nib. And that's one of the things about vintage. It requires more focus and effort on the writer's side to get them to perform properly. Some of them are more forgiving than others. This one is more on the you must write the way I want you to write perspective. So we're going to say bye again as we experience another ink starvation issue, but I still love this pen, and I'm glad I restored it, at least to somewhat of a writing condition. Enjoy your day, enjoy your life. I like this color.